Good afternoon. So today for our plenary, we'd like to talk more about what Dr. Drescher, Dr. Adler, and everyone during the introduction has already been talking about. And that's how COVID-19 and the internet and the changes to the internet since COVID-19 have impacted communication, specifically our patients' communication for us as psychiatrists, and what this could mean for our field. And this is a question that GAP is already talking and thinking about. But now with COVID, we need to think even more. We need to think about what's already being thought about, which is how we can leverage the internet as a means of communication so that organized groups of psychiatry can communicate with the public. The internet's changed society. It's a change in the means of communication. And if you look back through human history, you see that changes in communication have a drastic impact. Think back to the development of the written word, human language, the printing press, and in the 1990s, the internet. But it's really changed since COVID. Because of the fact that it's a contagious pandemic, it's forced society to use the internet even more as a means of communication. It's caused us to lean into this. And this is really relevant for us as psychiatrists because we are a field that deals with communication, a field that's able to use the internet to communicate with our patients through telepsychiatry when we need to, during a time of great social unrest, upheaval, and we need to think about this because it means that psychiatry is at a crossroads. Now, a crossroads. In order to recognize a crossroads, you need to have seen what came before and what came after. And us fellows, we're new to psychiatry. We're even newer to GAP, where we are here as your guests, as the fellows. So we decided that for our plenary to talk about this, it would be good to interview some of you. So we did a series of Zoom interviews, talking to you, asking you about GAP, about the use of the internet, and about recent changes. GAP's coming up on its 75th anniversary, and it was formed in the wake of a disruptor, World War II. There's certain things that are benchmarks, pre-war, post-war. COVID-19 will be one of those things. So let's hear briefly from Dr. Jack Bonner, who talked with us about the formation of GAP and how it was formed in the wake of a disruptor. At the end of this video, if tech cooperates, you're gonna have a poll that pops up on your screen. So there's gonna be some music and there's gonna be a box. When that box comes on, the questions have been approved by the publication board. Click your answers and push submit. Then you're going to see the responses from everyone who answered the poll, and then we'll keep going on with the plenary.
I didn't know much about the history, of course, until I began to look at joining. And then I heard these stories about GAP's origins, and people tended to talk about something called the Young Turks. And I didn't know exactly what that was at the time, but you hear this story kind of repetitively, and it really is that psychiatry really was still in the dark ages in many ways up until World War II. And there'd been certainly some advances from medieval days in psychiatry, but we didn't have a lot of effective treatments really until World War II. And then when the war was over, there were a number of psychiatrists that came back that felt like things needed to change in psychiatry, and we needed to make, as a field, we needed to make changes in the way things were done. And the organized psychiatry was really the American Psychiatric Association, and And when they came back, they were youngish and eager and full of ideas. But the APA was a little more of a stodgy organization, and so they wanted it to shift, but there was a good bit of resistance to that. So Walter Benninger and some other psychiatrists at the time decided to come together and start another group, which became GAP. So GAP really started in attempting to address some of the both the abuses of psychiatry and to bring forward some more modern thinking in terms of how to treat patients. But over time, as our methods of communication have changed, GAPS had to adapt, and we no longer really do the monograph model, but we move far more in the direction of doing more timely publications like journal articles or even articles for news publications, if you will, that can really be timely and up to date.
So as you can see, we're a generationally diverse group, and we're here together in the midst of a new disruptor, COVID-19. And we challenge all of us in our committees to continue doing what's already being done, which is to look at how we can leverage the internet as a means of communication. But not just that, but as a means of communication with the public, and maybe as a way to shape the field of psychiatry and what it looks like after this pandemic is over. To this end, us fellows are going to go ahead and talk about a number of things. There's a couple of speakers. Not all of us are going to speak, but anyone who is not speaking worked just as hard helping us to form today's plenary, doing the research, recording the videos, doing the editing of the videos. The first person to talk is going to be Dr. Robin Tom. Hers was pre-recorded due to some conflicts that arose. However, she's discussing the internet and shifts in internet usage since the 90s and since COVID-19. Then Dr. Edwards, who will discuss the impact of the internet as a means of communication on our patients. Dr. Rachel Zettel, who's also pre-recorded, but will discuss the use of the internet for psychiatrists and the shift into telepsychiatry. Dr. Cliff Arnold will then bring us back to our main takeaway question, which is the use of the internet nowadays in communications with the public. And Mike Mensa will close us off with a conclusion and question and answer session. At the bottom of your screen, you're gonna see, I think a lot of you have already been using it, a chat box and a Q&A box. If you wanna have a discussion during our presentation, click on chat. Make sure you change it so that it doesn't just go to the panelists. You'll need to click panelists and everyone so that everyone can see your chat discussion. If you have a question that you would like us to answer, click on the Q&A function, type it in, and then Dr. Mensa will go ahead and address that to the panelists at the end. So with no further ado, here is Dr. Robin Tom to talk about recent changes in the internet.
In the 75 years since GAP was founded, the world has changed a lot, maybe even more so than any other period in history. One of the contributors to all these changes has to have been the internet. When we think about the COVID-19 pandemic over these past 10 or 11 months, we can really think about how we've really become reliant on the internet in a way that maybe even a year ago we would have thought impossible. One example of this is telepsychiatry. We've actually had the technology that we need to do telepsychiatry for more than 10 years. And yet prior to 2020, it was actually pretty rare. Early in 2020, though, right at the start of the pandemic, we all turned to social media or instant communication platforms. Think Zoom, Skype, Google Hangouts, maybe even FaceTime, to provide care for our patients when they needed it most. The apps that we had once used for personal communication with family and friends were quickly transformed to become a critical part of our daily work lives. So, to help you reflect on your use of social media and the internet pre and post pandemic, we've prepared 2 poll questions for you. Thank you for responding to our poll questions. Now, I'd like to show 2 videos that compare and contrast our use of technology back in the 1980s and also presently. So first, let's hear from Dr. Resnick, who reflects on the technological innovation of the fax machine in the 1980s.
And it was in the late 1980s that fax came in. And I remember when I first heard about it, I was doing a very complicated 50-page single-spaced report for a forensic patient in Pennsylvania, and I had to get it to them before Monday morning. And I was going to have my fellow fly from Cleveland to Philadelphia to deliver it. And then the attorney said that there was something called fax, and did I have that at my end? I could send it by fax. This is about 1988, and I had not heard of it, and so instead we actually had my fellow fly it in.
Now that we have heard from Dr. Resnick, let's hear from one of our current GAP fellows to see how a GAP fellow typically uses technology in a normal day.
In this chapter of the audiobook, you will learn the secret to the universe, and with this new knowledge, you will find inner peace and bring it to those around you. All you have to do is not be distracted.
From 89.3 KPCC, this is Take 2. I'm Austin Cross, in for A. Martinez. Thank you for joining us this Monday. Coming up, Hollywood keeps getting creative about how to do business. Oh, and that potential blockbuster Tenet you keep talking about, it's back on for a release date. That's ahead. But we start today with an eye on Sacramento, where if you listen closely, you might hear this song. Bills, bills, more bills.
Staff you talked to say were the consequences in some of these public hospitals. What did that translate into during the pandemic? it meant that.
So as you can see, our use of technology and the internet, both personally and professionally, has really changed in the last 30 to 40 years. That's probably an understatement. As you reflect on these differences, though, I'd like to leave you with 2 questions to ponder. First, how has the use of the internet affected the way we communicate and form connections with our patients? And second, how does the instant, constant ability to communicate with our patients affect our practice? And now I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague and GAP co-fellow, Dr. Matthew Edwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Psychiatry as a field is still working on catching up to this rapid change. Social media, instant communication, and online news have fundamentally changed our patients' lives. We need to understand the phenomena to best take care of them, especially now. The combination of COVID-19, physical distancing, and a socially divisive cultural moment has made these changes even more important to recognize. So let's look at the impact of all of this on our patients, and equally important, what we as psychiatrists can do about this. First, though, let's do a quick poll question on your own conversations with your patients about screen time. As you can see, the members of GAP have a wide range of uses and discussions about technology, and much of this has changed since the COVID-19 pandemic. It's important to appreciate the psychological impact that social media and instant news have had on our patients, our communications with patients, and with how patients perceive the social climate. Similar to the global pandemic, researchers have described the rapid spread of all kinds of information as a problem and termed this problem the infodemic. The threat of this has increased with the popularity of social media and other information technologies. The spread of information can include material that is both accurate and is misleading. And the spread of disinformation has increased, as has information that heightens health, social, racial, political, and other contemporary anxieties. How does this and the increased consumption of information lead to anxiety? And what effect does this have on mental health? As an example, we know that the obsessive online searching for health-related information, searching for non-specific symptoms that overlap with many wide-ranging conditions, can further increase anxiety. We also know that the online body of information is large and vast, and that individuals cannot process all of the inputs completely, accurately, and effectively. Research shows that these two processes, that is the obsessive search for information and the inability to appreciate and process large amounts of content, have been found to weaken human cognitive reasoning. We simply run out of bandwidth. Plus, this information exchange occurs bidirectionally. That is, just as individuals may seek out information that heightens anxiety, so too can individuals disseminate information or engage in behaviors that may threaten individual psychological well-being. And there is cyberbullying. It's not a new phenomenon, but applied mathematics research demonstrates a significant increase in cyberbullying since March 2020. Victims of cyberbullying are targeted now through ubiquitous means such as cell phones, video cameras, email, social media, and other websites. These targets experience greater signs and symptoms of depression, anxiety, and suicidal behavior. Victims of cyberbullying can display more overt signs of trauma, and these traumatic experiences can linger and impact individuals' lives for subsequent years, long after the actual threats have subsided. Moreover, both victims and perpetrators of cyberbullying are more likely to suffer worsening mental health and psychological health in other types of bullying, because victims of cyberbullying may go on to become perpetrators themselves through a process called internalization. So we've briefly discussed some of the hazards of obsessive and increased online activity so far, but how much is too much? And is there any objective evidence that increased exposure can endanger psychological well-being? To be sure, moderate use of digital technology is not intrinsically harmful and may actually be advantageous in our increasingly complex, interdependent, and globalized world. Yet many of you probably receive daily or weekly prompts summarizing your recent and average screen times. What is the rationale behind these efforts? Well, public health researchers have found that adults exceeding 4 hours of daily television and screen-based activity had an increased GHQ-12, a short general health questionnaire with higher scores representing worse mental health status and outcomes, compared to individuals with less daily activity, say less than 2 hours a day. Moreover, adolescents with more than 2 hours of daily screen activity had greater odds of poor self-reported mental health outcomes. As a medical student, I lived just a few miles from Texas City, a small city in the greater Houston area, and home to the largest petrochemical plant in the United States. As we all know, stress can play a direct role in our physical and emotional health. We learned from research in Texas City and the greater region that the mere proximity to petrochemical plants, to the psychosocial stressors and perceived vulnerability of those stressors, not the actual physical hazards, negatively impacted health. But it is important to recognize that the importance of that proximity, that physical proximity, is lessened when we consider how the internet can dramatically increase our proximity to everything without physical closeness. Perhaps nowhere are the hazards of proximity through internet communication more present than our current public health, racial, and cultural climate. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the harms of xenophobic racial scapegoating, particularly anti-Asian sentiments. The spread of terms China virus, Chinese virus, and Kung flu are just a few. Plus, even more traumatic, on a mass trauma type of scale, are the impact of viral videos, articles, and social media statements about events that are traumatic to specific subsets of society. As a resident, I watched the images of overfilled ICUs, makeshift hospital units, mobile morgues, and just widespread suffering for public consumption, all reifying the experience of hundreds of thousands of people dying from COVID. And it was scary. As I thought about my own hospital's potential redeployment plans and my role in it, it was scary. Much like the viral videos and online portrayals of police brutality. The fear of COVID-19 has shown a looking glass on the worst aspects of society. Viral media and other forms of communication from the internet have taken those worst parts of society and put it upon our patients on a repeated, daily, traumatic, and almost instant basis. Personally, I stopped watching the news. I stopped watching the news so that I did not have to see the viral videos of bodies piling up or see Facebook posts of my friends wearing ponchos and bandanas because they ran out of PPE. Just like I stopped watching videos of unarmed Black men and women dying across American cities. I stopped because I had to. I had to for my own sanity, for my own survival. I had to as a Black physician. Yet I found that even though I took steps to protect myself and continue on as best I could, even then I couldn't escape the harsh reality in a world where such information is so widely available. Perhaps the most memorable experience during this moment was a message I received from a patient. The patient had asked me if I wanted to defer a meeting during the week of the protests, and even for the following weeks, acknowledging that while she appreciated my role in helping to care for her, all of the news made her very concerned that she might be adding to my stress. There was not an easy way to answer this question. Indeed, it was important for me to have my own distance to process. Yet it was also important for me to continue with my work and not become disaffected by the onslaught of images and videos. We know that these images and videos disproportionately affect and impact Black and Latinx individuals. Traumatic events online are associated with depressive and PTSD symptoms. In fact, more frequency of experiencing traumatic events online similarly leads to higher levels of depression and PTSD symptoms. Traumatic events, killings, and news directed at members of a shared racial or ethnic group contribute directly to poor mental health outcomes in that group. African Americans who lived in states where police killed an unarmed Black man or woman reported more poor mental health days. Moreover, this phenomenon has a spillover effect to other people and regions indirectly exposed through news, online, and media coverage. This secondary exposure through media, called vicarious exposure, is excluded from DSM-5 criteria for PTSD, though studies find increases in PTSD and depressive symptoms in these individuals. The threat of vicarious trauma and its impact on mental health increases with increasing exposure. So when you talk to your patients about screen time, consider, especially now, delving deeper into the content of their screen time, their response to it. Are they sitting there repeatedly rewatching viral videos that worry them? We know that social media can be an engaging medium that increases friendship quality, increases access to information and resources, and can be helpful for some vulnerable populations, such as children with autism spectrum disorder. This connection is even more important now than ever before, now that we're physically distanced from each other. It allows us to maintain some social connection, like we're doing this afternoon by having our plenary online. However, patients have unfettered access to online content and media like never before. Patients have difficulty digesting and assimilating information or processing it in a comprehensive and helpful way. The rapid spread of information, accurate and false, disturbing and not, has an impact on mental health. Some of it, to a particular subset of society, is potentially traumatic. Research suggests that more screen time leads to worse mental health independent of content, and harmful racial, ethnic, political, or social content increases this and leads to even worse mental health outcomes for patients, particularly populations who are unfairly vulnerable, targeted, or affected. Some ways to mitigate these issues include educating. Education, medical, and mental health professionals can discuss exposure to dramatic content with patients to help them cope. Some strategies may also include technological interventions, such as disabling automatic playing or replaying of content. Talk to patients about the content of their social media and media consumption. And discuss exposure to traumatic content with patients and help them cope. Lastly, put things into context. Please do be honest about the threats your patients face, but also help them to not catastrophize the threats around them. Thank you for allowing me to speak a bit on how this communication affects our patients. I would now like to yield space to Dr. Rachel Zettel, who will discuss how we communicate with our patients.
Hi, this is Dr. Rachel Zettel. As my colleagues have already discussed, COVID has affected our patients and us in ways we could have never imagined. So today, I would like to talk about how it's affected our practice, the kind of technologies that we've been using, and the ways to use that technology and still remain safe. First, we're going to ask you guys some questions. So speaking of technology, So pros and cons of moving our practices online. The first pro is that our patients generally like it. I've had a lot of patients who would prefer to do that all the time. I think part of it might have to do with sweatpants, but who knows? Decreases in no-shows, which I personally experienced as a resident. My no-show rate went from around 30 to 40% down to almost nothing, partly because it was a lot harder to say you were stuck in traffic when I was talking to you on your couch. Easier to respond to emails than voicemails. Less transportation for both patients and potential providers. And this is very helpful for our patients who don't have cars, who don't have access to public transportation, or don't have the money to pay for public transportation. It just takes that whole thing out of the equation, and then they can just talk to their doctors. And regarding the providers, we've been using this for a long time for our rural populations, especially when we have patients in different rural locations, because instead of eating up 3 or 4 hours driving, we can spend that time seeing more patients as long as we use a telepsychiatry platform. Easier to find providers and get referrals, which I think the majority of the population has really moved to all the information we seek. We just Google it now. And that includes who's the best doctor in town and how do I get to see a psychiatrist. So some cons, access to high-speed internet is variable. So we know that there are certain populations who just don't have the same access to healthcare as others. And when we had to switch to telepsychiatry, that loss of access or that lack of access was made crystal clear that this is a serious problem in multiple populations that need to be addressed in order for us to meet the needs of all our patients. Patients are more likely to contact providers after hours and expect immediate responses. So in today's day and era of 100% instant gratification, it is difficult sometimes for patients to understand that we may not be able to email them back at 8:30 at night because they wanted to know if we could do 2 capsules of 10 milligrams instead of 120. There are a lot of other reasons why patients may try to contact us after hours, but it's always important to set up good boundaries, which we'll talk about later. But this is definitely one of the cons. The loss of valuable person data. So what I mean by in-person data, for example, is if I had a hand trimmer right now, you may not be able to tell because you cannot see my hands. I could have pill rolling, I could have an intention trimmer, my leg might be shaking or might be contorted, and you wouldn't have any idea. And that's kind of the scary part about when we're seeing our patients online, because if they don't bring our attention to things, we might miss them. Whereas if we were in the office, it would be right in front of us. More difficult to get labs and vital signs, 100%. And even if our patients do have blood pressure cuffs at home, I'm not really sure how many take them to their doctor's office and make sure they're calibrated right. So we might not have a good idea of what's actually going on with some of our patients. And it's also really hard to find labs if you don't know where to go and how to seek out the right labs that your doctor may need, especially if it can't be done electronically and the orders can't be put in electronically and you're trying to find a lab near your home. And it's very difficult if there's an emergency. We may not know the location where our patient is at if we're doing it through telepsych and they're on their phone. They may not want to tell us. And so that kind of tacks up the danger of doing it this way, of using instant communication. Also, we don't have a patient that's in our office that our staff can come and sit with while we call 911. It kind of leads to a lot of variables. So we'll talk about this. And then minimal privacy for providers. I think today's generations have gotten so used to our whole lives being online that we forget that there was a time where you could have real anonymity and no one had any idea who you were unless you let them know. I think going forward, it's going to be almost impossible to not have an online presence and continue to keep your practice running. I'm sure it still can be done, but I think it'll be kind of hard. So let's hear some other thoughts from one of our very own, Dr. Jack Drescher was nice enough to let Dr. Matt Faddis interview him with a couple of questions on kind of how he has seen technology change the way we do psychiatry.
Well, the internet has changed everything. I mean, I once found the political donations of one of my teachers in my analytic training. You know, and so your the details of your home purchase, your political contributions. Those are easy things to find. So so the idea that the psychiatrist could be anonymous and patients not know about who they were is a fantasy. It doesn't exist in the modern world. I'm a contemporary psychoanalyst, so I believe in therapist self-disclosure. You know, some of my more traditionally trained colleagues are freaking out in the COVID epidemic, for example, because their patients can see their homes while they're doing teletherapy. So
Well, thank you, Dr. Drescher. We appreciate that. Things to be aware of when we're communicating with our patients online. So there's no such thing as an informal conversation when speaking with a patient. Even if it's over something that's pretty benign, I would still encourage you to keep the formality as if you were talking to them in person in your clinic. The other issue when we're discussing online is that, and I think it'll come up here in a minute. Yep. Online disinhibition effect. So this is actually a well-studied effect that occurs, and people, like when we get online, we forget that we're still expected to act the way we would in person. So sometimes we let down our guard, we'll talk in ways we normally wouldn't. And sometimes we'll make comments we normally wouldn't make, comments like when we're in our office or when we're interacting with patients. So just remembering that that is a real phenomena. And it's not really a conscious thing that you're doing. You just for some reason wind up getting more relaxed because you feel kind of disconnected from the person because they're not in your personal space. So how does feeling invisible or anonymous affect the way that you communicate or behave online? So again, back to the disinhibition effect. It's those feelings of being invisible or anonymous that can change the way we're interacting in general. So guidelines for communicating with patients. So these are just some that we got from the American College of Physicians that I thought was really good. And, you know, it was a good way to kind of think about it. So for example, the first one was they recommend that we use emails or text only with patients who are attending follow-up appointments. So if it's a patient that you're going to be seeing in person or that you're going to be doing telepsych with regularly, and they send you an email or a text, it is okay to communicate with them, but I would do it as sparingly as possible and with the least amount of detailed information. So if you can keep it generalized and just make it more of a, hey, let me contact you tomorrow or let me call you tomorrow about it, instead of putting any kind of like specific things in those emails or texts. So send an email first to confirm that you have the right address. I cannot tell you how many times I have typed in the wrong address just for random things, but I don't ever put any kind of important information in there. I will put, hi, this is Dr. Zettel from UT Southwestern. Is this the correct information or the correct email? Please reply. Limit the type or amount of information disclosed through emails. Again, just be careful. And then maintain professional hours and respect timing of sessions. So this is part of kind of taking care of yourself and your own mental health, as well as being able to take care of the patients. It's important to have a separation from your work and your home life, not only just for the, well-being of yourself and your family, but also it's good for patients. If they don't ever learn how to operate without you being there to hold them up and like continue to support them at all times, they're never going to be able to go on and, live their life without needing treatment. Now, if you have more information about this topic, I highly recommend this Telehealth and Community SMI Population paper. It was written by our very own Psychopathology Committee, and it's just got a lot of really great information, a lot of details about the stuff that I went over. And I don't know, I read it a couple of times, thought it was pretty good. So, okay, guys, well, these are our sources and things. Thank you so much. And we will continue on.
Hi, my name is Cliff Arnold. I'm going to summarize and build on the excellent work of my colleagues so far and discern some big overarching ideas about media and what they mean for our profession and for GAP. The first big idea is that we are immersed in media like never before, especially in this time of COVID. You might have heard the story of the two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. He nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" I work with adolescents, and I wager that 9 out of 10 of them, if I asked them, "How's the media?" they'd say something like, what the heck is media? So our first point here is that media is just the water we're swimming in, often unnoticed and taken for granted. Social media, online news media, even communication media like Zoom, our experience right now. All of these media powerfully shape how we see and exist in the world, even when we don't realize it. And the video you saw of a typical morning of a GAP fellow illustrates this. In the 1940s, when GAP was founded, people engaged with media for roughly 2 hours a day. Whereas now, we're immersed in media for a vast majority of our waking hours, around 10 hours a day before COVID, and now upwards of 13 hours a day on average by some estimates. We're just swimming in it. The second big idea is how large an effect this media has precisely because we are not aware of it. To continue the water analogy, when you're in the middle of a big river, far from shore, it's hard to even tell that you're moving or what direction is forward. We don't always perceive media around us, and we miss that it is sweeping us along, sometimes in directions we don't intend. A study by Pennycook and colleagues found that people progressively lose the ability to perceive truth the more they're exposed to false headlines. And this seems intuitive, right? But the impressive thing in this study is that this happens after only one repetition of false headlines, even if the fake headlines are not very believable and labeled as such, and even when the message goes against the subject's political ideology. So, first point, we don't see the water we're swimming in. And the second point is that we can miss that it is carrying us along in its flow. Third point, the sheer volume of information can drown and disorient us. The philosopher Jacques Ellul writes, quote, "It is a fact that excessive data do not enlighten the reader or the listener. They drown him. He cannot remember them all or coordinate them or understands them. If he does not want to risk losing his mind, he will merely draw a general picture from them. And the more facts supplied, the more simplistic the image," end quote. This seems to be our situation with the media, that far from being enlightened by so much information, we can be drowned by it, or at best, draw simplistic and overgeneralized conclusions. So to recount our three ideas: 1, we don't always see the media that we're swimming in. 2, it can sweep us along in an imperceptible flow, sometimes in a direction we don't intend. And 3, sometimes it can cause us to drown. So what does this all mean for our profession in general and for GAP in particular? With each of these three situations comes a challenge. And I believe that GAP is meeting those challenges head on in really compelling ways. First, the answer to an unconscious and uncritical immersion is to step out of the water. Personal practices of prayer, mindfulness, exercise, friendship are all ways of connecting with the reality outside of our media flow. And the whole concept of the GAP meeting is to step out of the everyday waters that we're swimming in and remind each other of the big, real, pressing issues that surround us all the time, but that we don't always see or contemplate. So what a fantastic antidote Gap meetings are to the uncritical, passive, day-to-day mode of existence that we can find ourselves in. And the second challenge, to that challenge of media sweeping us along in unperceived falsehood, here is a video of an interview with Dr. Jack Drescher reporting about some specific Gap efforts.
One question I had for you is thinking about the internet, social media, and how quickly false information can spread, especially pertaining to psychiatry and mental health. What do you think is the role of today's modern day psychiatrists in terms of challenging these things as soon as they come up?
Trying to correct the distortions of fake news could be a full-time job. I mean, in many ways, I gave a lecture at the APA in 2009 on how politics distorts science, and there are enormous deliberate distortions going on, and the distortions are really not meant to argue the issues. In the professional arena, the issue is to confuse the public.
In thinking about all these distortions and all the false information that can be out there, what is GAP doing to address this?
GAP is a small organization, and it's only in recent years that we've developed a fast track for reviewing for opinion pieces, op-ed pieces. So it's possible if there is a GAP, if there's a burning issue that a GAP committee would like to write about, we'll give them a couple of days turnaround.
And in your experience, what does the APA do when these burning issues come up? How do they handle it?
Experience over the years is that APA is often very reactive to media issues as opposed to proactive. And APA will try to respond as quickly as possible if a quick response is needed. They'll respond with press releases. APA press releases get attention from the media, and people come to APA when journalists will come to the APA when there are distortions from somewhere about some mental health issue, and APA's communications office will reach out to the usual people who are established as experts and are good at speaking to the media on the issues.
Dr. Drescher's comments here underscore how powerfully media can sweep people along in false directions, but that there is hope in the form of efforts like GAPS and the APA's to combat falsehood with the truth. And finally, there's the third challenge, that media can drown and disorient us in a deluge of information and too many options. And this is a challenge not only for consumers of media, but also for those who would use it to further their cause. Among the many great examples in GAP of using media wisely, I had the pleasure of speaking with Mayram Bendat, a consultant to GAP's Committee on Psychotherapy. As you may have read in a recent email, Dr. Bendat and the committee achieved a monumental victory just this month when a federal judgment came down that requires the nation's largest insurance company to greatly improve its mental health coverage and to reprocess nearly 70,000 past claims. This is a huge win for tens of thousands who suffer from mental illness and many more to come who will benefit from the nationwide precedent this sets. The point for this plenary is that Dr. Bendat has engaged online media all along the way of this 7-year battle, having interviewed with CBS News, NPR, The Washington Post, Forbes, the LA Times, as well as cultivating a following on social media like Twitter. And he has done it in exactly the sort of focused and goal-directed and persistent manner that seems so difficult to achieve in the current media maelstrom. What struck me when I was speaking to Dr. Bendat was the way that he grounds his work in 3 big ways that keep his message focused and his mission clear. First, he grounds his work by featuring the real-life, on-the-ground stories of actual people who suffer from mental illness. Second, He grounds his work by maintaining an exceptional amount of humility, by getting out of the way, so to speak, by not promoting himself and instead promoting his cause. And this comes across if you meet him. And third, he grounds his work by making sure that the causes he undertakes are worth pursuing, by orienting himself and his convictions before heading into the media fray. And Dr. Bendat confirmed that this was, in fact, a very good synopsis of his experience. So, in closing, Dr. Bendat and all of the GAP efforts that use media wisely are signs of hope, that despite the many challenges that media can certainly pose, and which we've talked about, it can just as certainly be harnessed for good. And again, there is so much hope in meeting like this, in coming together and reminding each other about the reality outside the water that we're swimming in, and reorienting each other in the direction forward to advance psychiatry. Thank you so much for your attention and for this amazing opportunity to be a GAP Fellow.
Yeah, hi. Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Mensa. I'm from UCLA, and I will be speaking and coordinating the Q&A session. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues for an amazing presentation. I mean, I think we've run the gamut of a lot of, fast-moving topics in a fairly succinct and helpful format. And I'd like to especially thank Dr. Vanderkar for her excellent leadership throughout this project. It's been really an honor to follow her lead in creating this product. Just for our discussion purposes, I'd like to go through a bit of what we talked about today, specifically when Dr. Chen talked about the history of GAP with Dr. Bonner, and talked about how communication has influenced the organization. And then Dr. Tom talked about how COVID has sort of thrust our field into the internet era, whether we liked it or not, and sort of went through the losses as well as some of the benefits of that. We've definitely gained some exposure to and expertise in technology, but we've also lost the ability to come together and drink juice and commune. So definitely some big losses there for sure. Dr. Edwards spoke eloquently about the vicarious trauma that we are witnessing as a result of COVID, racial disparities, and the disproportionate COVID burden in certain populations, which is an ongoing developing situation, as well as cyberbullying, which is something that surely many psychiatrists are encountering an increase in. And then Dr. Zettel and Dr. Jean-Paul Naylor went over a day in the life of telehealth, as well as some good tips on how to better manage patient care over the internet through different modalities and things to watch out for. And then Dr. Arnold again gave a great overall summary of how the internet has impacted psychiatry and how he sees the internet impacting future iterations of psychiatric practice. And so there have been a few questions submitted to the group, to the panelists, and I'll go over a couple of them. And I welcome more questions to be added to the Q&A function at the bottom of your bar. It says Q&A, it should be on the right side. There, I see some questions building or growing there. The first question, I think, is an important one that goes beyond psychiatry because of the pervasive nature of telecommunication currently in our society. 90% of human communication is nonverbal. There are 42 facial muscles that convey feeling. What is known about what is lost on social media that affects the clinical alliance and outcomes? And I'll direct this to any one of the panelists, and once we get an answer from the experts, I'll chime in with a couple pieces of information. So if Matt or Dr. Jean Paul Taylor wants to take this one, give their take anecdotally or otherwise, that'd be great. Okay. I can let me start. I can start answering. So first, I mean, I think this is a pervasive problem. I think people using teleconferencing have really lost the some of the um, uh, intangible contact that Dr. Gross referenced when he was addressing the group. Meeting in person is so much better and so much richer an experience for human beings than being in showing a video or seeing people through a video. In fact, this has been such a pervasive phenomenon that there's actually a fairly robust literature on it that I will now send to everybody in the group, panelists and attendees. The first book is an Economist article on Zoom fatigue and its sources, and the second is more of a psychological take on that phenomena. And essentially both argue that the pauses that occur during Zoom meetings, the 0.2 seconds or whatever that it takes for our images to be transmitted to the person we're talking to, then trigger a suspicion of a natural suspicion of that person who we're talking to, because in normal in-person interactions, a 0.2 pause might indicate thinking, which may indicate a desire to either lie or deceive the other person. And so that natural instinct then sort of undermines a rapport building and can be a factor in why people have less of an enjoyable experience on Zoom. But I'll yield the rest of my time to Dr. Jean Paul Taylor so that she can answer the question as well.
No, I think that was a great response. I think it is just such a different world than in real life, and figuring that out is something that we're still working on and trying to make that compatible and similar. I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done to really understand that.
Absolutely. I think this is going to be an ongoing large part of our literature, especially in psychiatry, moving forward. Looking at outcomes in comparing telehealth to in person is going to be helpful. There are benefits to this as well, which then lead to the second question I was sent. Which was, we now have telehealth. It has an ability to spread psychiatric care to places it could not go before, whether those are rural areas or areas where people, are just not able to get to our offices. However, there's also this, downside that I just mentioned about patient care. And so, in sum, is this remote connection more therapeutic, more beneficial than in-person visits? And this is open to anybody. And of course, this is a fairly open question. So we're looking to just hear what you think.
I mean, yeah, I think I'll jump in. I think access is huge. And I think there was a big push for telepsychiatry for rural areas even before COVID. And I think that this has greatly expanded patient and provider comfort. And I would argue that this can only lead to more mental wellness. I think we've had access issues for various reasons in psychiatry forever. And this is breaking down a lot of barriers that we previously thought were impenetrable.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Awesome. I think those are factual, very important points to be made. Absolutely. I think, it's just difficult in this time to also have a good feel as to what the general impression is regarding these issues. For one, the cyberspace is only open to those who have the technology in their homes, the internet, the computers, and the time and the privacy to access the internet. And so there's a digital access gap now that has been created as a result of COVID that, of course, is going to harm disproportionately socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, as well as rural populations. And so as much of an increase of access that we've had, geographically in terms of space, in terms of time, there's also been a sort of an increase in the minimum amount of resources necessary to actually access healthcare. So that is a trade-off that's worth mentioning.
Thank you, Mike. Oh, I'd like to add something to that.
Go ahead.
And that's it's quite interesting how, on the one hand, telepsychiatry has expanded, our ability to connect with patients in these sort of new and in large ways. And in some ways, it's also continued to highlight disparities in access in others. One of the experiences I've had, working at the Palo Alto VA in the Bay Area, has been that I had a telepsychiatry clinic prior to COVID-19. Those patients largely were in very rural and remote areas. They lived on like large plots of land without access to internet, and they would actually go into physical clinics in order to get connected with telepsychiatry with staff. Almost all that patient population completely became a telephone clinic because they were unable to access the same technologies because of the use. And so in some ways, I found that the telephone encounters were both constraints for some and pluses for others. So I think a lot more research should be sort of explored into how we can continue to strengthen alliance with patients across various modalities and means of access.
I think that's an incredibly important point. Adding nuance to the discussion. Not only is there a digital gap between those who have access and those who don't have access, there's a gap between those who have video access and those who have telephone access and those who have other types of technology. So, I think it's a disheartening experience to see that, someone who once could come to clinic now cannot because of COVID. And that's sort of the crux of what I think might be a point of moral injury for some people, for some providers as well. There was a process question that was brought up that I think is interesting. I think all fellows can answer this one, and this might be our last question since we are just about at time. Can the fellows talk about the process of creating the plenary and how they adjusted their process as the pandemic unfolded? And I think Ashley would be best suited to answer this one, so she can go ahead and do that.
Am I showing up on the screen?
Yes, you're.
Let's see. I think, Mike, if you want it, there you go. So it's interesting because the notion of the impact of the internet on psychiatry is something that we began talking about at our first fellows meeting over a year ago. And then after COVID struck, we'd been in the process of nailing down who was going to say what and how are we going to do this in a live presentation. And then things shifted to look more at the internet and its impact on psychiatry recently. So we had a couple of Zoom meetings, we had a lot of email correspondence, and we broke up into groups, and there was a video team. There were teams of people assigned to each of the different subsets within our new realm of our topic, looking at the internet in light of COVID-19. And everyone went out and did their various aspects for the presentation. We continued to correspond in a WhatsApp group. We had a Google Drive where we posted our work, and we just sort of turned and pivoted to change our old presentation topic into something that had become even more relevant.
I think are there any other, that's fantastic. That's a great summary of what has been, in a tremendous effort by Dr. Vanderkar to coordinate, busy residents to do work on a video project that is, is fairly time intensive. For every 1 minute of video you see, that takes about 25 minutes of editing to really create. So it is a time intensive effort. Are there any other panelists who want to speak about their process? I'll just say that the work is it's a pleasure to present on this topic, and it's great to be at the bleeding edge of hard work and psychiatric practice, which is what COVID has forced all of us to do. Speaking of innovators, I'd love to introduce Dr. Ruth Shim, who has been a great steward of our education over the last 2 years to start her part of the presentation. Go ahead and take it away, Dr. Shim.
Thank you, Dr. Mensa, and thank you to all of the fellows. I think that was just a really engaging and wonderfully thoughtful presentation. So we're very thankful for the work and the pivoting that you all have done in this time. We only have a few minutes left, and what I wanted to do is, this is the time in our typical, if we were in person, we would be doing our graduation ceremony for the fellows right now. And unfortunately, as we've discussed in this plenary, we have to do things differently now. So instead of me handing out certificates, Francis has been incredibly wonderful at making sure that all of the fellows receive their certificates by mail. And so instead of a formal presentation, I'd just like to actually just announce the fellows, each one of them, just if we could just acknowledge each of them right now, to thank them for their incredibly wonderful work that they've done for the past four meetings and sessions and all of the work that they put in between. So I'd like everybody to pretend that I'm handing out certificates now, and I'd like to recognize Dr. Clifford Arnold, Dr. Sinlin Chen, Dr. Nikichi Conte, Dr. Matthew Edwards, Dr. Matthew Faddis, Dr. Za Janapal Naylor, Dr. Michael Mensa, Dr. Giovanna Sabrino, Dr. Robin Tom, Dr. Ashley Vanderkar, Dr. Eunice Wen, and Dr. Rachel Zettel. So thank you all so much. We appreciate everything that you've done. We've enjoyed having you as fellows. We invite all of you to return in future meetings for a more formal final meeting, and we thank you all for this great presentation. Thank you.